morning, everyone. My name is Randy Forbes. I'm an assistant professor at the College of the Bahamas, and I'm pleased to be your moderator for this session. Under the theme, Sectors in Need of Liberalism. Before I begin, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our guests and co-sponsor and partner of this event, the Atlas Network. We at the Nassau Institute endorse your vision for a free, prosperous, and peaceful world where limited government defend the rule of law, private property, and free markets. I would also like to thank the other guests who are here with us this morning to participate in this timely event. For our special guest for this session is Dr. Rodgers, and he was reminding me about the housing crisis and the financial crisis that is now taking place. He would like to expand on in his presentation. Each of our speakers will be given 15 minutes to share their ideas with us, and it'll be followed by a 20 minutes Q&A. I would like to adhere strictly to the time so that we can get everything done this afternoon. I will introduce each gentleman. Of course, I would abridge their bio because you have their flyer in front of you. Each of you could go ahead and read the details. But to summarize Dr. Rodgers' contribution, Dr. Rodgers is the author of 2 books on the Bahamian economy. And I'm always fascinated by Dr. Rodgers when I listen to him present, because by profession, he's an ophthalmologist. Am I correct? Correct. Yes, but he speaks extensively on economic issues. His first book was entitled, Is It Really Better in the Bahamas for Bahamians? And the second book is entitled, The Bahamian Dream. And I know he will elaborate on that. All of us would like to know, exactly what it is to be a Bahamian. What is the expectation of the Bahamian? Our second guest is Mr. Mort Taylor, who is the co-founder of Signal Power and Light. This company was founded based upon the belief that given the opportunity, innovation, technology could be applied in such a way that people would have greater access to energy throughout the world. Mr. Taylor is a native of the state of Alabama, where he attended Brigham South College and earned a bachelor's of arts degree in history and later a law degree from the University of Alabama. Currently, Mr. Taylor is involved with an innovative team that is desirous of establishing, a new venture with the Honduran LEAP zone. And I'll be pleased to hear more about that. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the podium. Our first guest, Dr. Rodgers.
Thanks, Randy. Thanks, Atlas. Thanks, Templeton, for allowing me to speak today. Now, I'm going to talk about investment freedoms, or to what extent they're being compromised in the Bahamas. I'm going to come at it from the perspective of the economic, structural issues that we have that impair investment freedoms in the Bahamas. First of all, how do you define an investment? Well, the financial definition of investment is buying or creating an asset with the expectation of capital appreciation, dividends, profits, interest, or rents, or some combination of the above. Now, when we talk about investment freedoms, what are we talking about? I think the Heritage Foundation has a list of 10 things that they describe as involving investment freedoms. And those are business freedom, trade freedom, monetary freedom, government size, fiscal freedom, property rights, freedom of capital flows, financial freedom, and labor freedom. I'm going to address 4 or 5 of these just briefly. But you notice that government's involved in all of this. And the question is, what is the role of government? And I think that Professor Robert Schiller, in his recent book, Finance and the Good Society, establishes, in my mind anyway, a good explanation of what government's role should be. And he says, to provide a clear set of rules for the game that protects the consumers and promotes the public interest while enabling the players to compete in doing what they do best, which is delivering better products and services. So in the Bahamas, let's start off with business freedom, or what we're really talking about is ease of doing business. And as most of you who are Bahamian would know, it's not easy doing business in the Bahamas. Opening up a bank account can be a very onerous exercise. You can go to the United States and open up a bank account within a few hours. In the Bahamas, it takes 2 weeks. Company formation is also problematic. Getting a business license can be fraught with problems. Land registration is a problem. And real estate transaction costs are extremely high, up to 15%, which really kills a lot of real estate transaction or real estate potential transactions. We also have core inflation. I'm going to talk about this more in a little while. But core inflation refers to the fact that the base price of everything in the Bahamas is far higher than it should or could be. There's also the issue of social capital. And what I mean by this is, and this is really Michael Pettis' definition of social capital, professor of finance in Beijing. It's the ability of an economy to absorb investment capital and use it in a productive way due to limitations in the institutional structure of the political infrastructure, the legal infrastructure, or the financial infrastructure. And I think that the Bahama issue is a good example of where we have a problem with social capital in this country. Now, many of these things are difficult to reverse and address, but I think core inflation is one of the areas that could very easily be addressed. We need to bring down, obviously, the cost of utilities, the cost of money, that is interest rates to the banks, the cost of land transactions, the cost of import duties. We need to improve our human capital, and government certainly needs to incorporate the use of technology more in its affairs. As far as monetary freedom is concerned, we're really talking about price stability, which is currency stability and inflation, and price controls. Now, if you look at the advantages of having a fixed peg, as we do, where $1 Bahamian is supposedly equal to $1 US, there's certain advantages which are related to currency risk in terms of direct foreign investors, in terms of import-exporters, and also in terms of debt repayment. Supposedly also, if you have a peg currency, there's decreased domestic inflation. And you also have the bragging rights that you have your own currency, and there's some sovereignty associated with having your own currency. But there are also disadvantages, because you tend to over-import, you tend to under-export, you tend to import inflation. There's a false sense of security of the real value of your dollar. Because if our dollar were to devalue, and we now have about 25% of our GDP of our total debt in foreign currency, then you have a big problem, because your principal goes up, as do your interest payments. Of course, there's the impossible trilogy, which is that if you have a fixed currency, a peg currency, then you have to choose between your own monetary policy or capital controls. And we've chosen, in the Bahamas, capital controls. Yet, we have not used monetary policy to our advantage. In my personal opinion, had the Central Bank of the Bahamas lowered interest rates several years ago, there would be more people in their homes today, and certainly more businesses open. Price stability looks at two types of inflation, core inflation and CPI inflation. And certainly CPI inflation has not been that bad in the Bahamas, but we have very high levels of core inflation. For example, if Americans had to pay over $4 per gallon of gas, 44 cents a kilowatt hour for power, 8.3% on average for their home mortgages or home loans, the American economy would go into recession. But that's what we're faced with every day of our lives in the Bahamas. So core inflation is a huge problem here. And there's a direct correlation between levels of core inflation and your competitiveness as an economy. For example, It costs a hotel room in the Bahamas, it costs $37.50 in electrical charges per day to keep a room open. We can go down to Acapulco and have an all-inclusive vacation for $35 a day. So one of the reasons why we're no longer competitive in the tourism market is because we priced ourselves out of the market. And we also have co-inflation because of the monopolies that exist in the banking system and the utility system that maintain prices at a very high level. There's also a lack of price, or there is a lot of price control in terms of how our government bonds are priced and the coupon on those bonds. Those rates are set by the central bank, and they have a formula which they've been using for the last 20 to 30 years. Should interest rates come down, then obviously the coupon rates would come down, and government's fiscal deficit would come down as well. So what we actually need to do to solve this problem is undergo a managed devaluation of the Bahamian currency, or what I call an internal devaluation, not an actual change in the exchange rate, but bring down core inflation. If you bring down core inflation, then automatically things will come into balance, and the cost of vacation will be cheaper in the Bahamas. The cost of doing business will be cheaper in the Bahamas. So if we change, for example, from oil to natural gas in the production of electricity, if we reduce the central bank interest rates from 4.75%, say down to 1 to 2%, and if we change to a sales and service tax on everything and gave up the VAT tax and just have a 15% sales and service tax on imports, then the cost of living would come down dramatically, as would the government's debt repayment scheme. We also need to bring down the cost of land transactions to, for example, I recently bought a place in Texas for my daughter, and it was about $325,000, and the transaction costs were less than $2,000. In the Bahamas, it would be 15%. And we need to eliminate these monopolies in the banking sector and the utility sector. Now, in terms of the free flow of capital across borders, it's said that the Bahamas is an open economy. Well, it is open if you're foreign, but it's semi-closed if you're Bahamian. So let's look at why does capital cross barriers? Well, mainly for 4 primary reasons. First of all, capital will flow to wherever there are productive investments. So if there's a more productive investment in the United States, then Bahamians should be allowed to invest in the United States. More productive in the Bahamas, then in the Bahamas. Capital tends to follow interest rates. Wherever interest rates are highest, in which you have a financial center, that's where the money flows. And also the security of capital reasons. In other words, if we're challenged here and we think there's going to be devaluation, then capital would automatically leave the Bahamas. And there's speculative flows associated with hedge funds and corporate entities who need to hedge for whatever reason. So what's the answer to that? The answer to this is to adopt a dual currency system a la Bermuda, where Bermudians are allowed to have foreign currency accounts. And in Bermuda right now, there's 112 US dollars for every $100 Bermudian. So their currency is actually overpegged. In the Bahamas, we could do that, and it's estimated there's about $10 billion worth of Bahamian-owned currency, foreign currency out there, and money would come back into the Bahamas, and we would should allow the hotels, the direct foreign investors, and the banks to pay Bahamians in US and pay their bills in US. The issue of property rights is also a burning issue with me. We have tremendous problems with Crown land and with generation property. It's estimated there's about 2.5 million acres of Crown land in the Bahamas that's left. And I say left because the UBP oligarchy, the PLP and FN oligarchy have pillaged our Crown land over the years. And this is actually our biggest national asset, our land. But no one in this room today can go to the Crown Land Department and find out who has the Crown land, what are the terms of the usage of the Crown land, and there is no data bank, there's no register, there is no nothing. Every single piece of Crown land that's granted in the Bahamas is determined by the Prime Minister of the day. This is a disgraceful situation. Generation property is also a big issue. There are acres and acres and acres, hundreds of thousands of acres of generation property that's just sitting there, and the rightful owners cannot utilize that land, cannot develop it, cannot sell it, can't collateralize it. And it's really a shame, because there'll be hundreds of Bahamian millionaires overnight were this situation to be sorted out. And there are laws in the books that can be used to sort out the generation property situation. So what we need to do to sort the Crown land situation, in my opinion, is to form a National Land Bureau that's run by the private sector but be mandated by government, and rezone all the Crown land into residential, touristic, agricultural, whatever, and then allow people to purchase or lease the land in line with whatever the national economic policy is going to be. Okay, now say a few words about tariffs. Yes, I'm going to finish with tariffs. Tariffs are really a form of consumption tax, as is VAT, and it's a major cause of core inflation. But it's a trade-off between either a consumer tax or income tax, and I think I'd prefer a consumption tax. But government is really the primary recipient of all this money, so it's a transfer of wealth essentially from the private sector to government. And depending upon what they do with that money determines the investment outcome. In the Bahamas recently, we had a situation where a lot of the new VAT money was used to fund Junkanoo Carnival, which was a $12 million loss. I wrote an article about that in the paper recently, and we'd actually have to have about 90,000 additional tourists coming into the Bahamas for us to break even on that. That's 91,000 additional tourists above the norm for that period of time. And there's also the paradox of the peg, which a lot of people don't fully appreciate, and that is that when there's an increase in economic activity in the Bahamas, there's an increase in imports, there's an increase in government revenue, because government makes most of its revenue from import duties, but there's also a decrease in the reserves. And this leads the central bank to utilize moral suasion on the banks to cut back on credit, which leads to a decrease in economic activity. So that's the paradox. When the economy is going well, the government's making money, people are investing, but the reserves are being depleted, which causes the central bank to cut back. So the answer to that, obviously, is to have this dual currency system where you have all of the money that you need in terms of US dollars. And what that would do would actually force the government corporations to be more efficient, because right now they're pulling on the US dollars that's generated from the private sector. But if government actually had to provide its own US dollars for its own corporations, then they would have to become more efficient in their operations. And of course, if we had a sales and service tax that I alluded to before of 15%, based on a GDP of $8 billion, government actually take in about $1.2 billion, as opposed to the $800 million it takes in now from import duties and from excise taxes or stamp duty that exists right now. So government actually have more money, and core inflation would come down, and there'd be more investment opportunities for all. So that's about it for me for today. Thank you very much.
I just asked Dr. Rodgers, I said, I wanted to make sure I understood you. Did you say 44 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity? Okay. Stunning. Okay. My name's Mort Taylor. I'm fourth generation family energy company. This time yesterday, I was in a swamp. We were conducting some drill operations on about 2,000 acres of property. I'm trying to get on the phone with Delta Airlines because we run out of pipe and we can't case the well. That's a whole other topic. I get here late last night. I'm very tired. I get in the taxi cab. Very nice gentleman's driving me. He asked me, why am I here? And I said, well, I'm here to talk at a conference about the need for competition, electrical generation in the Caribbean. And he immediately started telling me about the BEC And that went on for 20 minutes. We get to my location where I'm staying. He's still talking about the BEC. I didn't even think he took a breath. He was talking about the BEC and going. And I finally had to interrupt him and say, this is a fascinating conversation. A couple of hours ago, I was in a swamp, and I'm really tired. And also, I just want to make sure you're not charging me for this while you're talking about it. And he said, no, the meter. So I got a real visceral sense in terms of how passionately people feel about power generation and the situation with the BEC right now. I was, just real quickly, like I said, my family, we've sold power to utilities in the southern U.S., or sold energy, fuel to the utilities in the southern U.S. now. We're getting close to 100 years of business operations, fourth generation. And so that's been my focus, has been my life. I heard about special economic zones that were being created in Honduras called ZEDEs, which stands for Zone of Economic Development and Employment. It was a very, very interesting concept. I was asked to go down there as part of an investment group about 1.5 years ago to talk about investment in these special economic zones. And I'd prepared just some very basic calculations in terms of infrastructure and, just basic stuff, water, power, roads, things like that. And in meeting with officials in the government and talking about electrical costs, they looked at me and they kind of laughed and they said, where are you getting these electrical costs from? And I said, well, I was taking North American costs and maybe adding 25% as a cushion. And they said, why don't you double or triple it? And by the way, that's not uncommon in Latin America or particularly the Caribbean basin. And of course, I came back to the U.S. and I said, well, talk to my family. And I said, let's start a company and let's look at power generation in Latin America as a way to really lower energy costs, penetrate the market, and help a lot of people. Because I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know in terms of economic development. Energy is a cost that's borne by everyone. In my opinion, and I think the economics would back this up, there's probably not anything that affects a person or a worker's productivity more than the base cost of energy. If you lower the cost of energy, you conversely or along with that, you increase a person's potential for productivity. And what happens is when you're in an environment, an economic environment, where the cost of energy is so high, the only way the economy can stay competitive is to depress wages. And that's particularly true, and I was very interested with what Dr. Rodgers said, when the cost of capital is high. So you have high cost of capital, high cost of energy. The only way the economy is going to stay competitive is to lower wages. And you see that throughout Latin America, and in particularly where we're in business right now in Honduras, you see that particularly true there. So in looking at the history of energy and trying to look at some general trends, what I've noticed in the Caribbean and Latin America is you generally see sometime in the 50s, maybe into the 60s, you saw a consolidation and you saw a big push by various governments to provide power and energy. You saw the establishment of monopolies, state-run electrical enterprises. And then generally into the 80s and 90s, when the cost of petroleum was under $20 a barrel, you saw a big push into what I'm sure is your favorite fuel, the bunker fuel and diesel fuel. And that worked until it didn't, which in 2004 we had a demand shock coming from demand out of Asia for the price of petroleum, and of course we had $120, $130 a barrel price. Today it's somewhere in the 60s, but it's still historically, even in the 60s from a historical basis, is still very high. And now you have sort of the double whammy of a monopolistic system that carries its own inefficiencies, in addition to you put all your eggs in one basket regarding a single fuel source, and that fuel source is a very high price. So in the Bahamas, of course, you have I think 44% bunker diesel or diesel C production, 56% automotive diesel, industrial diesel. You have I think 16 isolated grids because of the archipelago. And from what I could tell, you have about I think the statistic that I got was a 16.34% grid loss, which means just over 83% of what actually gets put into the grid you actually get paid for back. That's a little high in terms of and that's either inefficiency in the grid or theft of power. Of course, as you all know, there's been an announcement by the government for the unbundling of the system. Okay? And in my own research, and you guys are living it, so I'm maybe telling you things you already know, but in my own research in terms of what the plan for the electrical unbundling is here in the Bahamas, is to divide the BEC into two companies, a production company and a transmission distribution entity. And those two entities, as two private entities, would enter into a purchase power agreement, a PPA, where one would sell power to the other, but then to open up management of the two entities under private management that would be bid by the government. And as I've sort of read the newspaper reports, media reports, I'm not quite sure if those contracts have been awarded yet. I think there's been some discussion about it. There's also been, announced a 20-year energy plan in the Bahamas through 2013, where there have been announced targeted goals where the Bahamas would move to 30% renewable energy production by 2033, either via solar or wind. Bahamas is governed by primarily three laws that regulate energy. One was passed in 1956, which created the BEC. There are two other laws, I think Outer Island Electrical Law and the Outer Island Utility Law. The significant aspect of those laws is that no private entity can enter the market to produce power on the grid unless it is, quote, in the national interest, and no one's, as I understand it, no one's ever been able to meet that legal threshold. Okay. And so there's also been talk of amending that law to allow private generators to enter the market and send power into the grid. I suppose that's the thinking in dividing transmission from generation. But it appears, and again, you guys are going to know it probably better than me, it appears that the push is to make that specifically for renewable energy sources, that to the extent you continue to use fossil fuels, gas, coal, whatever you use, that's going to continue to be run by the BEC. Some interesting statistics I found. So I'm using 2010 numbers. That was the best statistic that I could find that was available in terms of BEC costs. 2010, the cost of operation for the BEC was $466 million. Of that, what percentage would you guess of that cost was fuel cost alone for bunker diesel? What would you guess? 81%. 81% fuel cost. $378 million of the $466 million of costs on a single fuel source. Okay? There was a pre-feasibility study that was co-sponsored by the Inter-American Development Bank. And they looked at, and I know Dr. Rodgers mentioned about switching to natural gas as a fuel source here. They actually conducted a study on cost savings that would represent. Okay? Switching to natural gas, whether in compressed or liquefied form, will reduce fuel costs in the Bahamas by 36%, down to $242 million. So you go from the $378 million, 81%, to $242 million, just over 52% of the cost. That would, according to their study, reduce the kilowatt hourly cost the average Bahamian pays by 33%, a third by switching fuel. Just a third. There's been discussion of a proposal by the BEC to construct a 128 megawatt dual production facility at Clifton Pier, $200 million project that would burn both gas and bunker diesel as a dual fuel facility. I'm not sure that's ever gotten off the ground. I read something about it. I don't know if that's gotten off the ground. Not. Okay. So I'll just give you just some thoughts. When you're looking at, clearly I think most people here are of the opinion, I know I certainly am, that to the extent you can introduce competition, particularly in the energy field, it is the best, the most efficient, fastest way to lower costs for the average person. Okay. The good news, when you're looking at unbundling an electrical system, is there are examples of other places that have done this, and you can learn from the good and the bad. You can look at the Chilean example, for instance, where they took two companies, they divided generation into 5 and transmission distribution into 8 different entities. You can look at the UK, which did some good things and then did, in my opinion, not some good things. You can look at Texas. You can look at, I think, some examples in the United States that are good, or Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Massachusetts did a good job. California did a terrible job. I think, in my opinion, what they've done in Honduras, at least in what they've enacted in the legislation, they copied the Texas model. I think, at least on paper, it's very well done. And then in the Caribbean, you know, one place I've looked at is the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Islands has a publicly traded utility that provides power there. It's traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange. It has shareholders. It's totally open in terms of it's totally visible. I think it has a market capitalization of about $150, $180 million company. And so they have private generation in the Caymans. I notice here that again, the plan, at least from what I've read in the Bahamas, is to divide divide into 2 companies, generation and transmission. I will say this, and then to have those 2 entities run by private companies instead of government-run companies. I will say this, and this, bear me out when I say this. When you look at the history of unbundling in different countries, and I use the UK here as a good example. Privatization is not a panacea. Privatization does not produce lower costs unless there is competition within the privatization. In the UK, you ended up with a duopoly for generation for the production of industry, for the production of energy. And that didn't work. There was implicit collusion. Didn't work, okay? When you're looking at unbundling, and again, I'm giving you my opinion, my thoughts, the single most important factor in lowering energy costs for the average person is competition at the generation level. And again, let's go back. What was the percentage of the fuel cost? 81%. That's what you got to focus on. And the only way you're going to lower that is through a competitive process. It's the only way. The other thing is, when you're dealing with a monopolistic energy system, you tend to get this sort of, again, the fuel source becomes such an important factor in it. You tend to get this sort of fuel of the day or the fuel du jour. Okay, right now it's natural gas, and it makes sense because natural gas is so cheap. Makes sense, right? Well, diesel fuel made sense in the 80s and early 90s. And all the eggs got put in one basket, and that, like I said, that worked until it didn't. Okay? And what you will see in a competitive energy market where private interests are the ones taking the risk and not the public, you see competing fuel sources, right? Just like where we have coal assets in the U.S., we have to compete with gas, and where we have gas, we have to compete with coal. Makes sense, right? Right, and by the way, and don't throw tomatoes at me when I say this, boy, if you want to get cheap fuel right now, go talk to some of the coal producers in the United States, and you can get some cheap fuel. Okay? I mean, if you want to lock in some cheap fuel, there you go. And in a competitive market, those are the kind of things that would happen. That's what you would see. You would see competing fuel sources, competing power generation, because electricity is a little different. You can't store electricity. The physics don't allow you to store it. So in order to make an electrical market function in a timely manner, respond to supply and demand like other commodities do, you have to have competing generation sources. Have to. It's the only way it works. When you have competing generation sources, putting into a pool from which the local distributor, neighborhoods, whomever can buy from, they can timely respond to supply and demand, and that has the transformative effect of bringing the cost down. I do want to make one other comment, and I'll make this quick. There's been an announced, as I said, in the Bahamian Energy Plan, there's been an announced goal of moving to 30% renewables by 2013. That compares to, I think, the 20% goal that was announced by there's a Caribbean organization that announced a 20% goal. So this exceeds what's been announced for other Caribbean nations. I'll just be brief about this. I understand the intuitive logic for most people of pulling power from the sun or power from the wind. Let me just say this. In my opinion, the perception of the benefit that renewables can bring under current technology and the reality, there's a little bit of a gap in the public perception in terms of the benefit of that. I would look very, very carefully at the experience that Germany has had in moving as aggressively as it has to solar energy. The interesting thing about this, of course, Germany has greatly reduced its nuclear capacity, has moved very aggressively to solar and wind as a way to make up that capacity on the grid. They are burning more coal today than they were before they switched to solar. They're emitting more CO2. And again, I won't bog you down in the engineering on this, but there are two types of power. There's base load and peak. Okay? Base load power is like that Honda engine. It's just consistent. It runs. To hit peak demand requires the electrical provider to ramp up. The more efficiently and the more he can predict that ramp-up period, the better his profit margin. So from a utilities perspective, the better you are at predicting your customers' habits between base and peak, the more profitable you are. That's your margin. What happens with renewables, and Germany's been a great example of this, what happens with the sun? Is the sun always predictable? So you see all of a sudden huge ramp up when the sun comes out. It overloads the grid. Germany has literally had to pay Poland to take their excess power. It's true. Then when the sun stops, you see a huge drop. So what do the fossil fuel factories of utilities have to do to make up for the drop that happens very suddenly? They've got to ramp up. It's very inefficient. And they end up burning more coal, more coal than they did before. So again, an announced target of 30% by 2033. I understand the intuitive appeal of that. Be careful about it. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. We now open the floor for any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. I will ask a question to Mort Taylor. I think you put some special interest in the competition in generation and the private sector competing with each other in terms of fuels and everything. The other side is the distribution system. What happens with that? Because we have the Dominican experience, for example, that generation is private, there's sort of competition, but distribution is state-owned. and it is very inefficient. Actually, 34% of the electricity that it buys, it gets away of the grid, either by fraud or inefficient grid. So I would ask, what would you say about either private sector intervening in the distribution system, how to regulate that, and if it's possible, how to introduce competition in the distribution area? Because that's I think is very important, and it's very difficult to do that in the distributional side.
Great question. So let's talk about different ways it's been done, okay? Because the world doesn't offer perfect solutions. You pick the best that you're given, So there are different ways you can do it. Okay, so I'll give you Honduras as an example. Okay, where I think they've done it. I think what they've enacted on paper has been good. So what Honduras is going to do is for their distribution is essentially they're going to have a managed distribution system that will function a lot like what we would call a public service commission in the United States, but some sort of managed entity that will manage distribution, and what they'll do two things. Number one, they're supposed to guarantee access by all generators onto the grid. Okay, supposed to. Number two, they're supposed to create the spot market. Okay, and then of course I guess the third thing is they're supposed to set a price for transmission costs. Okay, so that's one way you can do it. Okay. What I would, it's just me, what I would prefer is, I would like to see completely open competition for anyone who wanted to get in the distribution business, just like anyone who wanted to get in the generation business. And because when you look at transmission lines, I think the general cost is just under $1 million per kilometer. If you want to do a 69 kV line, that's generally what you're looking at. Okay, if you look at the economics of that, if you charge 1 cent or 2 cents a kilowatt hour, it's very profitable business. And so there is a profit motive to create distribution. So $1 million per kilometer. And we were looking at this just the other day, and I want to give you a good number. $1 million a kilometer at just over a cent a kilowatt hour. Look, we were looking at 18-19% IRR. Well, right, and so what I would, this is just me, what I would advocate is if you're going to unbundle and you're going to divide them up, for the distribution entity, let's call it Distribution Incorporated, don't give it a monopoly over distribution. Allow that competitive force to because I can tell you that whether someone actually wants to construct a line connecting two new places. I tell you a good example is the history of the American railroad industry in the 19th century. Because there you had a large capital cost to connect cities by rail line, okay? But what you saw is by the introduction of at least quasi-competition, you did see that at least kept prices somewhat in check, because there was always the threat that if you charged too much connecting two cities, someone else would come in, and again, a 19% IRR on a 69 kV line, you better be careful with your pricing. Somebody will see that. Somebody will come in and build one. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, I have a question for you, Dr. Rodgers. Like I said earlier, I'm always impressed with your presentation, and you did a thorough job. But I was looking for the mentioning of the introduction of the NHI, the National Health Insurance, that big effort being put forward by government. How would that hinder investment? And also the introduction of minimum wage, increase in minimum wage.
Yeah, well, these are two tough questions. I'll do the minimum wage one first. there's a proposal by government to increase the minimum wage in the Bahamas, and certainly it's needed. In my second book, The Bahamian Dream, I state that the average income in the Bahamas, median income, is about $17,000 a year. But you need about $45,000 a year to live in the Bahamas. There's a big gap. And one of the reasons why you need more money is because of core inflation. We have to pay so much for everything. So if you actually bring down core inflation by implementing the things I suggested earlier, what happens is real wages actually increase. So a combination of reducing core inflation and increasing the minimum wage will help to solve that problem. You know, there are arguments for and against increasing the minimum wage. You know, they say that if you increase the minimum wage, then people will hire fewer employees, businesses won't expand as much, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is, in the Bahamas, people really don't make enough to live at a half-decent standard. And when this occurs, people are left with three choices. They either have to beg, steal, or borrow, or a combination of all three. And we see those in the Bahamas every day of our lives. There's a tremendous amount of theft, there's a tremendous amount of begging, and there's an even greater amount of borrowing. And if you bring down the interest rates and you bring down the energy costs, so just talk about energy costs for 1 second, NIB puts about $15 million into the economy every month. Without that, the Bahamian economy would be in big trouble. If you bring down the electricity rates from 44 cents, say, to 15 cents or 20 cents even, there are 90,000 households in the Bahamas. The average electrical bill is $400 a month. So you're putting in an additional $18 million of disposable income into the economy, which is more than national insurance actually puts into the economy. So that in itself will lead to more consumption and more economic activity, and businesses obviously become more profitable and they can reinvest, et cetera, et cetera. With regard to, and then the other thing about the minimum wage is, there's always a question of, are people compensated adequately for their productivity in the workplace? And that's a very interesting question. If you read Piketty's book on capitalism, he says that in general, 70% goes to labor and 30% goes to capital, and that's been the average throughout history. And when you get discrepancies in this balance, then it either goes towards capital or labor, and then you get imbalances and things get out of whack. Okay, that's another story. Right. So as far as NHI is concerned, the biggest problem in the Bahamas with healthcare is that, as far as government is concerned, is that the inefficiencies in the system. Okay, there's a tremendous amount of wastage on how we procure things. For example, we have a national drug agency now, and this is responsible for procuring drugs, and we now have a national drug plan whereby young people and elderly people get the drugs on the plan. But at the same time, the last administration introduced allowed civil servants to also be a part of the plan, even though they have health insurance, and they can quite rarely buy the drugs with their insurance. In Eastern Europe, what they do is every quarter, the government drug agency puts out to bid every single drug that's on the plan. So that every quarter, they get the best price possible. In the Bahamas, we're still going through the wholesalers who are making a tremendous markup, and so we don't really get the best price. If you look at the maintenance of equipment in the hospitals, the public hospitals in the public sector, the average life expectancy of a piece of equipment is about 5 to 7 years in a well-run hospital. In the Bahamas, I'd say it's 1 or 2 years. Okay, so there are a lot of inefficiencies in the systems that have to be corrected before we move to the National Health Insurance Scheme, Otherwise, all those inefficiencies will be magnified and there'll be even greater losses. And besides, the businesses can't take on another tax at this point in time.
Interesting. Okay, thank you very much. Any?
Good morning. My name's Trevor Sunderland. I'm going to possibly continue some of the discussions that you had with your taxi driver last night. Being a long-time resident of the Bahamas, I'm one of the sufferers of BEC and BTC also, another issue. But I'm interested is that the Bahamas government has decided it needed to do something with regard to BEC, yet there are certain constraints when they try to do alternatives. Usually it's a demand that the number of staff or employees stays the same. And another item is something to do with what we call national pride, is that the Bahamas government must maintain ownership, majority ownership of either of the utility companies. Now my question is that we're looking at a North American utility company to help us with BEC. You asked a question. The actual agreements have not yet been signed, at least to my knowledge they haven't. And at one point, will this company say enough is enough? There must be some advantageous or some profitability in it for this company, as there would be for your company, I guess, in Honduras. You're operating a business, you're not operating a charity. So how can these other companies, like yourself, sort of make profitability if your hands are tied behind your back because of other constraints?
Wow. I'll just put it to you this way. And let me just tell you my understanding. My understanding is that the bids that have been proffered are for management of the facilities, not ownership of the facility, which I think is what you pointed out. If I was told to come in and we're putting together a bid on managing, let's say, the Clifton Pier facility or some other power production facility, and it's bunker fuel, and I'm told that I can't. The employees have to stay the same. You put me in handcuffs right there. I'm told that the Bahamian government is going to maintain ownership of the facility. That I'm responsible for the productivity in the facility, but I'm told I can't control my employees and I can't own the equipment that I'm working on. About the only thing you can do is when you bid that cost has to be factored into your bid. And guess what? Guess who that cost gets passed on to? I think that's the best way. I don't know any other way to bid on it.
Okay. Because of time constraint, we need to bring this to an end quickly. I would just allow one more question, but I appreciate if you would keep it short and the answer short for me, please. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Just to clarify that the splitting up of the two entities, the government has changed its position on that. It's now going to be one entity managed by this foreign entity.
So there's not going to be a split between generation and...
No, they changed their mind in respect to it. But I wanted to support your point with respect to the competition. As you say, the main cost driver is the generation, and that is driven by the cost of the fuel. And so until we address that issue, we're not going to do much in respect to reducing the cost. Also supporting your point that this whole idea that we can bring in a foreign entity and everything else remains the same and get a benefit for the Bahamian people is a fallacy. It is a total fantasy. We have to look no further than looking at the power company in Grand Bahama, where that power company is ran by a private entity. It's privately owned. And they tried the same kind of model where they tried to separate the generation and the transmission and distribution, where the generation company sells the power to the distribution company, both companies still being owned by the same parent company. And the only thing that has happened is that they're making profit on both sides. And so the consumer really still does not benefit. What I think, though, as a national policy that would make much more sense for us is to split up the various islands. Each island is treated as an independent entity, and my personal preference, not speaking for anybody else, but my personal preference is to privatize those. And in doing that, you allow those companies then to go out to the market for competitive fuel and different kinds of fuel to the end benefit of the consumer.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just ask one, because I'm just curious about something. Is there any electrical market within the country? Let's say, for instance, I don't know how much electricity the Atlas hotels consume. I'm just guessing 2-3 megawatts of power. If they were to revitalize their air conditioning system and realize an efficiency in that, but they were required to purchase so much power under a PPA, could they sell that power back into the grid in order to recoup the cost of increasing their efficiency? Is there any sort of system like? Okay.
No.
Not
But there was an amendment to the Electricity Act that will allow companies to generate their own, a percentage of their own electricity and sell it back to the grid. So we're moving in the right direction, but haven't reached there yet.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll now take a 10-minute break and be back for our third session. Thank you very much for coming. Oh.
It's not only the first speaker, she just said.
Oh.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Oh, sure thing.
Oh, okay, sure. Rodgers, we don't have many of these.